Scholars, today we are going to add on to what we learned last time with how the Earth moves, focusing on revolution again, but this time really studying how the combination of Earth's revolution along with the tilt of the Earth's axis, how those two factors are why we experience different seasons here on Earth. So our I can statement for today is I can explain how the tilt of the Earth and Earth's revolution causes us to experience different seasons. So today you'll need your notes again. We've got our pencil ready. We're going to start by putting the date on our paper. Let's see, today's going to be the 24th, I believe. And we will get started with our notes. So just to get us started, we're going to review. Last time we talked about how Earth is constantly rotating on a tilted axis while also revolving around the sun. So the Earth is always moving in two different ways. And we've learned how Earth's rotation is why we have night and day. When the Earth turns away from the sun, we are experiencing nighttime during that time because we're in Earth's shadow. And when the part of the Earth that we're on turns toward the sun, we are experiencing daytime because we are in the direct sunlight of the sun. So again, here's that visual to help us remember. Remember, rotate means spinning on the axis, takes 24 hours or 1 day, causes day and night, whereas revolving or revolution is going around the sun, and that takes 365 days or 1 year. And when the Earth is revolving, because of its tilted axis, we experience different seasons. So just some questions to think about while we are getting started today. Think about what are the different seasons. So see if you can name those to yourself. 4 seasons: fall, summer, spring, winter. What is the weather like during the different seasons? So think about how winter and summer are different, and how spring and fall are kind of different from winter and summer. And then lastly, what do you think causes the difference in seasons? So why do we experience these different climates during different seasons? So why do we experience really hot weather in the summer, cold weather in the winter, and why are spring and fall kind of those in-between seasons? So just some questions to get us thinking about why we experience different seasons. So we're going to have a lot of different models to look at today to help us understand why we experience different seasons. So seasons are caused because of the Earth's changing relationship to the sun. And what I mean by that is notice how the Earth is always revolving. Remember, that means going around the sun. So when the Earth is in this location, compared to this location, compared to this location, and so forth, as the Earth is moving, the relationship between the Earth and sun is changing, and this is one of the factors for why we're experiencing different seasons. So seasons are caused because of the Earth's changing relationship, or its changing location in relation to the sun. And remember, you can always pause if you need more time to copy something down. Seasons are caused because of Earth's changing relationship or changing location of the Earth compared to the sun. So we know that the Earth travels around the sun every 365 days or 1 year. And we also know that the Earth is slightly tilted on its axis. So because of this, depending on the time of year, one of the hemispheres, remember we learned about the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, because of the tilt, one of the hemispheres is always tilted toward the sun, while the other half is tilted away from the sun, and we'll look at a model of that in just a moment. So as the Earth is orbiting the sun, the amount of sunlight each location on the planet gets every day changes slightly. So again, just to get a little bit more information, the seasons are related to the way that sunlight falls on different parts of the Earth over the course of a year. As the Earth revolves or goes around the sun, the North Pole is always going to point to the same direction in space. And so what I mean by that is we learned last time, and I'm just going to draw a quick sketch at the top of my paper real quick. We learned last time that we've got our two hemispheres, northern and southern hemisphere, but because of the tilt Okay, the North Pole here is always pointing or tilting in the same direction in space as it's revolving around the sun. So for about 6 months out of every year, the North Pole is tilted toward the sun. So in this case, again, you don't have to copy this down, but I'm just giving us a picture or a model to look at. In this case, we might notice how the North Pole is tilted toward the sun. And so because of that, the northern hemisphere gets more direct sunlight. That's going to be really important wording that we know. It gets more direct or intense sunlight. The northern hemisphere also gets more hours of daylight. So this is spring and summer. During the other 6 months, the North Pole is tilted away from the sun. During this time, the northern hemisphere then gets less direct sunlight and less hours of daylight. So that would be if I came over here now as the Earth is revolving around the sun. And now I'm showing its new location. Let me scoot that out of the way real quick. Now I'm showing its new location. But now notice the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the direction of the sun. And so it is experiencing less direct sunlight. And because of that, it gets less hours of daylight, and it's a cooler temperature. And during this time is when we're experiencing fall and winter. We will do a model of this at the end of our notes, but for right now we're going to come back and fill in a couple blanks. So the Earth is slightly tilted on its axis, and depending on the time of year, one of the hemispheres is tilted toward, that means pointing in the direction of the sun, while the other half is tilted away from the sun. And so we'll see this more in just a moment, but that's why depending on the northern or the southern hemisphere, which one you're located in, you're experiencing a different season from the opposite hemisphere, because one hemisphere is always toward the sun, the other hemisphere is away from the sun, so you're experiencing opposite seasons. For example, I think we talked about this earlier in the year, where we live in the United States compared to maybe somebody in Australia, our seasons are always opposite. When it's summer for us, it's winter for them, and when it's winter for us, it's summer for them. So for about 6 months of every year, the North Pole is tilted toward the sun. This is the one we talked about first. During this time, the northern hemisphere gets more direct sunlight because it's tilted toward the sun. Because of this, the northern hemisphere also gets more hours of daylight, and so this is when we would experience seasons such as spring and summer. Remember, our days get longer in the spring, and they are the longest in the summer, so we're experiencing more hours of daylight and more direct sunlight. On the other hand, during the other 6 months, the North Pole is tilted away from the sun. And because of that, the northern hemisphere gets less direct sunlight and less hours of daylight. So this, thinking about seasons, would be fall and winter, because again, our days get shorter in fall, and we experience the shortest days in winter, and we're also experiencing colder temperatures in fall and winter. We'll take a closer look at this in just a second. So again, when the northern hemisphere is getting the most sunlight, it experiences the warmer seasons, which are spring and summer. At the same time, though, the southern hemisphere is getting less sunlight, so it's experiencing the colder seasons, fall and winter. So again, thinking about all at the same time, here on the northern hemisphere you might be experiencing winter, but if you live in the southern hemisphere at the same time you're experiencing summer, because the tilt of the Earth makes it so that the southern hemisphere in this picture is getting the most direct sunlight, so they're experiencing summer, whereas the winter, up here in the northern hemisphere, they're experiencing winter because the sunlight that they're receiving is less direct, meaning it's not quite as intense. Here's the opposite side of that. So it says position of Earth in June. You'll notice that the summer is being experienced in the northern hemisphere, and that's because the northern hemisphere is tilting toward the Earth, receiving that intense sunlight, direct sunlight, and at this time the southern hemisphere experiences winter where the sunlight is less intense. So we're going to get ready to draw a model to help us remember this, especially as we go into our assignment in just a minute. So keeping in mind that depending on which hemisphere you live in, you might be experiencing a different season, we're going to draw just a quick sketch or a quick model to help us really get an idea of what this is like. So at the center, we're going to draw the sun, but we want to leave room on all sides so that we can draw the earth a couple different times as it's revolving around the sun. So we'll just label this as our sun, and then we're going to draw four earths to represent the 4 seasons and how the earth is tilted during each of those seasons. All right. So don't forget, we need to label or show the equator so that we can label the northern and southern hemispheres in each of our Earths. Remember, there aren't actually 4 planets here. This is just going to represent the 4 different seasons. We're going to take a look at what's happening with the tilt of the axis and the tilt of the planet in each season. All right, lastly, we want to show that the Earth is tilted on its axis. Remember, if you need more time, you can always pause. And because of that tilt, we're going to start to see that tilt. Let's start on this one on the far left side. That tilt, the northern hemisphere, is tilted toward the sun, so that means it's getting the most direct sunlight. So at this time, if we're living in the northern hemisphere, which is where we live, we would experience summer. Now coming this way, notice we are tilting kind of in between being direct and indirect. So this is going to be one of our in-between seasons, and this is going to be fall. So northern hemisphere is not receiving totally direct sunlight, or indirect sunlight. It's kind of in between. But since it's not direct, we'll see that we're getting a little bit less sunlight and our days are shorter. And as we come over here, again, notice to see which direction the Earth is tilting. It's tilting away in the opposite direction of the sun. So this is where we would experience winter. And then lastly, up top, we've got the northern hemisphere pointing in this direction. So it's not super direct or indirect. It's another in-between season. So we would label this spring, because as we're making this cycle, we're making our way back into summer with those longer days. And we can even draw our orbit to represent, remember, Earth is always orbiting or revolving around the sun. And so these are some of the different locations and the different seasons we would experience in each of those locations. And it's all connected back to the tilt of the axis and the tilt of the Earth. So are we tilting toward the sun and receiving direct sunlight, or tilting away from the sun and not receiving direct sunlight? So just to summarize what we've talked about today, we know that the Earth revolves around the sun and that the Earth is slightly tilted on its axis. And so depending on the time of the year, one of the hemispheres is tilted toward the sun while the other is tilted away from the sun. So notice we only labeled the seasons on the northern hemisphere because the southern hemisphere actually experiences the opposite season. So just for fun, just to give an example right here, since we live in the northern hemisphere, we would be experiencing summer, but for those individuals living in the southern hemisphere, since they're tilted away from the sun, if you live down here, you're experiencing winter, and so forth. It would be the opposite season. So for winter, they're tilting toward the sun, so they're experiencing summer here. So as a result, the climate of the northern hemisphere is different from that of the southern hemisphere because of the Earth's seasonal tilt towards and away from the sun. And therefore, when one hemisphere experiences one season, the other hemisphere is experiencing the opposite season. So go ahead, finish your model if you have not already, and then continue on with your assignment.